Hi, I'm Casey.
And I'm Colleen, and we're going to give you a quick lesson about segregation. The post-Civil War era had ended, and the North removed protection in the South.
The South identified as Democratic, and the image shown identifies that, and most heavily in Oklahoma, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, and North Carolina. In the most fair and just system in the nation, corruption began to set in, and discrimination in the Supreme Court started to take place.
In the beginning, there were laws passed which granted African Americans general rights.
But unfortunately, in 1833, laws were passed which stated that the courts could not legislate against racial discrimination.
For example, in railroads, hotels, and businesses.
This image illustrates the discrimination through the railroads in the United States.
The sign which the man is standing under designated a waiting area for colored people.
In 1896, a famous court case occurred which changed the way that blacks and whites were treated in society, called Plessy versus Ferguson.
This created the precedent of separate but equal.
The picture on the left identifies the segregation present which would affect each individual.
The picture on the right also depicts a man drinking from the drinking fountain labeled colored.
The South adopted laws called Jim Crow laws, which required segregation.
These laws were present in the South's washrooms, drinking fountains, park benches, and almost every public place.
This hindered the growth of the African American communities because they were banned from certain jobs.
This picture illustrates the segregation in certain sections of the United States.
As we said, in the South, segregation was required, which is indicated by the red.
In the North, including Wisconsin, where segregation was looked down upon, most states created legislation which forbade segregation.
In some northern states, there was no legislation which was put in place.
Out west, states had either no legislation on segregation, had forbidden segregation, optional segregation, or limited segregation, but there were no states which required segregation.
The group in the South which was causing drama were called the Redeemers.
Redeemers were Southern Democrats who wanted to gain power back from Republican regimes.
They used illegal tactics to intimidate blacks and keep them from fulfilling their civil rights.
They used race as a rallying cry, and they used the fear of colored people in gaining momentum and getting their agenda accomplished because of this. They did not solve issues which needed to be solved. They deflected attention away from what really mattered.
Through segregation, colored people across America were losing their civil rights.
This includes discrimination in the polls, literacy tests, poll taxes, violence, political primaries just for whites, and the grandfather clause were implemented to reduce minority voice in elections.
Literacy tests proved unfair because the designated schools for colored people received an inferior education to the white schools.
Considering the economic bondage caused by sharecropping, many colored people found it difficult to afford the poll tax.
White-only primaries not only directly restricted black voting, but also ensured that a candidate could not be voted for that threatened this segregation system.
These implementations would have restricted some white people from voting too, had it not been for the grandfather clause, which was a statute stating that white people were excluded from these barriers, so they were grandfathered in. Also, they could not serve on juries. They received stiffer penalties than most whites. Additionally, economic discrimination occurred because they were kept out of jobs which required specific skills, for example, a factory job.
They also were not allowed to learn good traits which they could use to pursue a successful job.
Instead, they were stuck in dead-end jobs like farming or low-paying domestic work. This political cartoon illustrates the challenges black people faced in attempting to fulfill their 15th Amendment right to vote, such as literacy tests, poll taxes, the Ku Klux Klan's intimidation, and lynching, while the white man gets to easily go up the escalator to vote due to the grandfather clause.
There was also a large response to segregation, as you can imagine. There was lynching that occurred, as well as disenfranchisement, which means that they could not vote.
Some saw the opportunity to flee the country, and did. Some chose to go to Africa. Bishop Henry Turner was a huge advocate for it, and he started the International Migration Society, which assisted in traveling to Africa.
Another person who responded to segregation was Ida B. Wells. She created a black newspaper which advocated against lynching and the Jim Crow laws.
Booker T. Washington also made a large impact with his response to segregation.
He created an agricultural and industrial school in Tuskegee, Alabama, and it became one of the best schools in the nation, and it specialized in work skills.
Shockingly, this idea was widely accepted by whites, who were typically not willing to compromise on issues regarding race.
But some thought this was a sellout to segregation, and they did not like the idea. They thought that this did not solve any issues.
Here is Booker T. Washington.
The effects of segregation sometimes left people hurt, wounded, unemployed, evicted, or even sometimes dead.
One example of an effect is sharecropping, which leaves one in poor economic situations which they are not able to escape from.
Because of this, they are stuck in an unending cycle. They have no resources to attempt to start a new life for themselves, and they are forced into sharecropping for their whole lives.
Unfortunately, they are not put in a better situation which they would be able to get their way out, and they are not able to gain skills for a valuable job which earns them a good income or allows them to expand their knowledge and gain a sustaining job.
This is an image which describes the amount of sharecropping in North Carolina in 1890.
You can see that about 1/4 of the counties in North Carolina had 35 or more farms which had sharecropping.
This picture describes the magnitude of sharecropping in the South during this time, and it puts into perspective the amount of sharecropping in the South.
All right, thank you for listening to our presentation, and hopefully it was informative on segregation in the South.